Hello everyone, welcome to Coding with Mock. In this video, we'll be looking at some simple reading and writing to files from within a Java application. Now, reading and writing is fairly simple in and of itself, but of course, there's always something we have to take into account. In this case, it's our colleagues and our file system, or a server file system. Namely, our colleagues, the system engineers, they want things to be secure, which is a good reason. But this means before we start reading and writing, it's a good idea to first check if you actually can read or write to a particular file. Sometimes you might not have the appropriate rights to read or write a file. Like with file operations from the previous video, we want to avoid throwing unexpected exceptions as much as possible. There will be times when we want exceptions, but we will explore that idea in another video series. Now, let's get started with reading a file. As I mentioned a minute ago, before we can actually start reading a file, it's good practice to first check if we can read the file in question. So, we start off with creating a path that points towards our file. Now, I want the path to our file. Create that as we've seen. Path of, and take in our data folder the text file, the file text, and the text file, or txt, right? And to read this file, we're going to start off with the files class, just as we did in the previous video. We start with the files class, and then we have a few options available to us. We'll start with the readString method, and the readString method takes a path as its parameter, and of course it's going to throw the exception. For now, I'm going to throw the exception outside of the method. You can surround it with a try-catch. I'm not going to do that in this case. For now, I'm just going to throw it out the method. Okay, good. Now, this method, as you can see here, returns a string and takes a path. I've already added the path. Now, the string is what we get back. So reads all the content. This method reads all the contents from a file into a string. Okay, decoding from bytes to characters using the UTF-8 char set. We'll look into that in a minute. So this method here returns a string. Okay, let's file text. We'll just catch everything that's been read into a string, and let's see what comes out of it. If I run my code, I can see it reads the whole file into one string. Nice. Now, sometimes I don't want one string. I don't want the whole file to be in one string. I want to have it separated. And usually you want to have a line-by-line reading of a file, right? Now, that's also possible. We have another method for that. Instead of using the readString method, I'm going to use the readAllLines method. I'm going to be using this one, right? Now, if you could have seen, this doesn't return one string, it returns a list of strings, right? So this method reads all the lines from a file and puts every line in a separate string. Okay, that's what this method does. So basically, what I have to do is I have to catch how are we going to call this variable? Text lines. There we go. And we're going to read everything into that list, and then just for each system out print line. Not going to execute this anymore. And if we do this, you'll see that our output is going to be the same. Now, the only difference is going to be that instead of having the whole file in one string, we're going to have every line in a separate string and the whole file in a list of strings, or actually in a list of lines of strings, right? So those are the two options, the two simple options to read a file. Now, as I mentioned before, it's actually a good idea to first check if we actually can read the file. Now, how do we do that? There's a simple option. We can use the files is readable file. This method will check if a file is readable and return a boolean, right? So basically what we can do now is if file is readable, we'll read the file, and then we'll have the option to output to the user, this file is not readable. Okay, now let's have a little check. I created another file, or set up another file, no access, which I can't read or shouldn't be able to read. So if I do no access.txt, I get this file is not readable. If I didn't do this check, if I just take this and replace it, I get an exception, something I don't want, right? So I get an access denied exception in this case. As we had in the previous video, if you point to something that does not exist, you'll get another exception, namely no such file exception. But in both cases, I want to first check if everything is okay, right? So if files is readable, file, and then we read the file. In the other case, I tell the user not readable. Okay. Yeah. So you can see, even if the file doesn't exist, it's not readable either. Okay. So your is readable will check 1, does the file exist? And 2, can my application access the file? Okay. Good. Now, there's another thing that we may need to take into account, namely character encoding or character encoding. Our hard drives can only store ones and zeros. Now, this means that our data, when we write our files or when files are being written, it needs to be converted to ones and zeros to be stored on said hard drive. And of course, there are multiple ways to encode data. Our computers use encoding tables. We've already discussed those in previous weeks, namely ANSI or ASCII or UTF-8, as you've seen a few seconds ago or a few minutes ago. But this means if we want to read a file, we need to use the correct table, and we need to specify the table that we want to use. Now, I have another file, LaTeX file here. Let's try and access that file. Right. Now let's see. I get a malformed input exception. This actually, and I'm getting that on line 13, on this line. So basically, what my program or what Java is telling me is that this file is readable because this returned true. So that's fine. My file is readable. But now I'm getting an exception because it said Java is telling me this file is not well formed. What does that mean? Well, this means that I'm using, or that the file is using, an encoding table that is not the same as the default encoding table. Now, the default encoding table is UTF-8, as you can see here. right? Bytes from the file are decoded into characters using the UTF-8 char set. Now, if your text file or your file isn't encoded using the UTF-8 text char set, that's when you will be getting this malformed input exception. Now, how are we going to correct this problem? We can correct this problem by telling Java, okay, you have to read this file, but use not the UTF-8, but use a different encoding table. Now, as you might have noticed, okay, it's not showing me it at the moment. Here we go. There's the read all lines, but this goes as well for the read string method. The read string is also overloaded, but the read all lines method here is overloaded. One with just a path, and the other one is with a path and a character set, right? So I'm going to expand my method or give the extra parameter. So I'm going to add my file. That's good. And now I want to add a char set. We use the char set class for this. And now there's a few options I have here. I can ask it for the default char set. Now this is going to, the default char set is going to ask your virtual machine, what is your default char set? In most cases, that will be UTF-8, right? Now, in some really specific cases, that's not the case, but in most cases, it'll be UTF-8. Now, we've already tried UTF-8, and that didn't work. So what is another option? The other option is actually telling it what char set you want to use for name, and then I have to give it a name. Now, I can't just give it a random name. My application is still going to compile, but now it's going to give me another exception, namely unsupported char set exception, something that my IDE, because this is the red line you see here is my IDE telling me random name is not a char set, right? Just keep in mind that this is your IDE checking this, not your Java compiler, right? Now let's give it a correct name. My file is encoded using Unicode. And there's UTF-8, UTF-16, but there's also Unicode, ASCII, and what's the other one? ANSI, right? Now, I've used Unicode, and if I read my file now, let's run it again. Now you can see it reads my file nicely and outputs everything, okay? Good. So now we've seen up till now reading files, checking if a file is readable, then reading a file into a string, reading all the lines separately and putting them into a list of strings. We've checked if a file is readable. Now, let's move on to the next part. Writing to files. Writing to files isn't that hard, just as reading files isn't that hard. We're still going to be using a path to a file. Now I don't want to change my existing files. Let's create a new file or a pointer. Let's create a pointer or a path to a new file. And let's start writing. We'll still be using the files class. Don't need the list yet. Files, and we'll be starting with the write string. Okay. Now, as you can see here, we have again an overloaded method with a path, a char sequence, and open options. We'll be ignoring the open options for just now. They're optional here, so you don't have to give them directly. That's not really needed, but we'll see why they become important in a minute. So files write string, I want to write to my file or my path that I just created, and let's write hello file system. Okay, let's see what happens here. Now, as you might have guessed, I'm getting a new file. And in my file, it says hello file system. Nice. Writing to a file, awesome. Now, that's the write string method. There was another method, namely the write method. Write method has also a few overloads, and we'll be looking at the first one here, iterable, and then a generic extends char sequence. This means that I can only have an iterable or a list or a collection of something that is a char sequence. Okay, so let's give it a string, a list of strings. I want to write to my file, and let's make a list of hello world. Simple. That's another option, right? So just like we could read into a string or read into a list of strings, I can write a string or I can write a list of strings. Okay. Now let's see if we can write this out. Well, where's my window? Ah, I closed it. Nice. Let's open it up again. Data, there we go. Now, here's my text file, new file, and it has hello world in it. Nice. Now, some of you might have noticed I did not delete this new file a second ago. So if we hello world again, if I run this code, and then I open my file, it says hello world again. Where's the data that I wrote earlier? So the thing is, if you do a simple write or a simple write string, it's going to create a new file. Or if the file exists, it's going to overwrite a file. Okay, so the existing data will be gone. Now, what are the options? Or what are the things that we can do to not overwrite a file, but actually append to a file, is I can add some standard open options, or actually some open options. Now, if you use the open options, this is the superclass of the standard open options, which I'm going to actually be using. This is an empty class, and you'll have to define everything yourself. If you use the standard open options, you'll have a few options available to you. Okay. Now, one of the things that we can do is we can append. Okay, let's see what this does. We'll do this a few times. Let's see what's in the file. Now it says hello world again 4 times, because it was already, my file already existed with hello world again in it, and then I appended it 3 times. Okay, so with the append option, it will add to the file. Now there's a lot of options here that we could use. We could use a create new or a create. Let's have a look at the create and the create new. The create option creates a new file if it does not exist. Is ignored if the create new option is also set. You can add multiple open options at the same time. To check for the existence of a file and the creation of the file, if it does not exist, is atomic with respect to other file system operations. Not important for now. We'll be looking into this atomic bit when we go over multi-threading. Okay. So what does the create new do? Create new creates a new file, failing if the file already exists. So that's the difference between the create. Your create will just, if the file already exists, it'll just use the existing file. If it doesn't exist, it'll create it. Create new will, if it doesn't exist, it will create a new file. But if it exists, it'll give you an error. Like we can see here. File already exists, right? But if I remove this line and just do the create, it'll be fine. Now, what's in our text file? 5 times, right? So if we don't do anything, if I just deleted the file, if we just create, it's going to create the file and then I append it here. But if I run this again, hold on, I have to close this. If I run this again, you see, it's in here 3 times now. Hold on, what's going on here? The first time it created the file and then appended, right? So let's try that again. It creates the file and then the second append happens. Now let's run that file, run this again. Did I close it again? I did. Bloody hell. And now it's in here 3 times. So what does that mean? This means that if a file already exists and I use the create option, it's just going to ignore this, right? My file already exists, so I don't have to write to it again, right? Append only writes to an existing file. So if I do this, really have to learn not to. If I just do this, it's going to give me an exception, no such file exception, because I said append to a file. And my file doesn't exist, so it can't append or it can't add to a file, right? So play around with these options later on in the exercises, because every option will have its own quirkiness, okay? So we've seen the write string and the write. Now there's also, some of you might have seen, the third option, where we can use a byte array to write to a file. Okay, now we will be looking at this later on in the next videos when we start talking about input streams and output streams. We'll be looking at byte arrays, reading byte arrays and writing byte arrays. This is when we go into binary files, because there's text files and there's binary files. The byte array you use when reading and writing binary files, but we'll look into that later. Okay, not for now. Okay, time for an exercise. So what I want you to do is I want you to create a data folder like I did here. Just ignore these files, but create a data folder, and in that folder you're going to be creating a new folder, namely source. And in this source folder I want you to create a new text file. Just give it a name, doesn't matter what name, text, whatever. Now in this file you're going to put the lyrics of your favorite song. Doesn't matter which song, just look up the lyrics online, copy and paste them into the text file. Okay, now what you're going to do is read that text file from within your application. I want you to read the text file into a list of strings. Then, using that list of strings, I want you to jumble around all the words. but not all the words. I want you to take all the words that are 5 characters or longer and switch them around. Okay, randomly. So every word, so my characters here and my words, those would be words that that would be allowable to be jumbled around, longer as well. So what I want you to end up with is something like this. Words longer, I'm gonna put that here, and characters here. So all the characters that are 5 longer or words, right? It's gonna be funny as hell. So you jumble around all the words that are 5 characters or longer, and then I want you to create a new directory, still from within your application, create a new directory in the data folder named target, and there I want you to write the new lyrics. Well, new or jumbled lyrics. Okay, write it to a new text file. I don't really care how you call that file, just give it a nice name. Okay, that's the exercise for this afternoon. Now, for the more advanced people among us, there's a little extension to this exercise. Namely, before you write the file, I want you to check if the file exists. If it does, I want you to create a new file. Now, not just a new file name, but not just a new file name. I want you to create a new file name based on the file name that's already, or the file names that are already in your directory or in your folder, and add a sequence to those file names. Okay? So if I put everything in lyrics.txt, then the next time I run my application, I want it to be put into lyrics001.txt. And then the next time I run my application, it's going to be lyrics002.txt. Okay? Now, if you really wanted to, you can call the first one 000. Okay? Now, how you do this is all up to you. You can be as creative as you want. But that's for the people that already finished this exercise. Okay? So start off with this, the base exercise. Read a text file into a list of strings, jumble up all the words, create a new directory in the data folder if it doesn't exist, and then write your new lyrics to a new file. Okay, and then the extension to the exercise is do not overwrite a file, but create new files. But think of a way to actually keep track of, or to examine the contents of your folder, and then based upon the contents of your folder, the folder, create a new file name. Okay, that was it. Have fun this afternoon. Be safe. If there's any questions, Pearl and me are available for questions on the Teams. So have fun, be safe, and see you in the next video.